All right, so get ready, because today we are going deep, deep into aesthetic experience.
Cool. Exciting.
It is. It is. You know that feeling when you
Yeah.
see like a stunning sunset or hear a song that just gives you chills?
Yeah.
We're going to unpack what's actually going on there and what philosophers have to say about it.
I love it.
We're going to be using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy
Excellent source.
as our guide, so get ready for some serious brain food.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. You know, what's really fascinating is that philosophers have been debating this for centuries. And it's not as simple as just like, oh, that's beautiful.
Right.
So we're going to explore whether, like a powerful storm or a moving novel,
Okay.
or even an elegant mathematical proof could be considered aesthetic experiences.
Okay, so it's not just about pretty pictures and sunsets.
Right.
That's interesting because I feel like that's how I've always thought of it. Like, beauty equals aesthetic experience.
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of the traditional view, especially when we talk about art or nature. But, think about it.
Yeah.
If it were just about beauty, wouldn't like every single detail of an object be aesthetically relevant?
Right.
But we all know that's not true.
Yeah, like if I'm admiring a sculpture,
Right.
I'm probably not focusing on what it's made out of to have an aesthetic experience.
Yeah.
So what are we actually focusing on then during these experiences?
So one of the oldest theories is what's called formalism.
Formalism.
Yeah. And to understand this, think back to, philosophers like Augustine and Aquinas.
Okay.
They were all about finding beauty in like harmony and structure.
All right.
Things like perfect proportions in architecture, the intricate patterns in a mosaic.
I like that.
It was a big idea during the Renaissance, too, with artists like Alberti.
So they believe that if something has a pleasing, like, structure or form,
Yeah.
that it's automatically beautiful.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's cool.
It is cool. And then along came Kant, who, you'll see, has a lot to say about all this.
Right.
But he kind of added a twist to this idea of formalism. He said there's kind of a pure beauty that we experience
Pure beauty.
when we enjoy an object's form without even thinking about its function.
Okay.
It's like appreciating abstract art
Interesting.
just for its shapes and colors and composition,
Great.
not for like what it represents.
Oh, so you're saying that with pure beauty, it's like the object's purpose or meaning doesn't even matter.
Yeah,
We're purely responding to its form.
exactly.
That's really interesting. I like that distinction.
Yeah, it is a really interesting distinction, but, not everyone was on board with this whole formalism thing.
I can imagine.
And people pushed back and they were like, well, is appreciating form the only way to have an aesthetic experience?
Right.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Can't we have these experiences with things that aren't traditionally beautiful or formally perfect?
Yeah, like music. A symphony has form and structure,
Yeah.
but it's not visual in the same way as a painting.
Exactly. Yeah. You're hitting on like one of the limitations of a strictly formalist view. Like,
Okay.
how do we even define form
Yeah.
across all these different types of art, let alone in nature?
Right.
It gets really complicated.
Yeah. Okay, so if it's not just about form, what are some other ways of looking at this? Like, what makes something worthy of this aesthetic experience?
Well, another influential theory is the idea of beauty as a power to please.
Okay.
So the focus here kind of shifts away from the object itself and more onto the pleasure it produces in us.
Okay.
And this is something that the British empiricists like Hume were big on.
So it's like beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Kinda.
Kind of.
But then if that's the whole story, like, why do we argue so passionately about art?
Right?
If it's just about individual preference, any opinion would be equally valid.
Right. People definitely have strong opinions
Yeah,
about what they consider to be good or bad art.
totally.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to Kant, who, as you'll see, had a lot to say about aesthetic experience.
Right.
He argued that aesthetic pleasure isn't just like random.
No.
It feels merited
Merited.
by the object. It's
Yeah.
like the object deserves that positive response
Interesting.
from us because of certain qualities it possesses.
So there's a reason we debate art so passionately.
Right.
It's not just preference.
Exactly.
It's whether the work earns its praise or not.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Isn't it?
I like that.
It's like we can recognize that a piece of art is well crafted, worthy of admiration, even if it's not our personal cup of tea.
Right. So does that mean I can have an aesthetic experience without actually feeling pleasure? Like, can I recognize that a piece deserves admiration without actually enjoying it? Is that still an aesthetic experience?
That is a fantastic question.
Okay.
And one that philosophers are still debating. Yeah, is simply acknowledging merit enough? Or is the subjective feeling of pleasure like a crucial element?
Right. Wow. This is getting complex,
It is.
but I like it.
It's tough.
Yeah. Okay. So we've got formalism,
Right.
we've got the power to please,
Yep.
and this idea of merit.
Yep.
What other properties of an object might be central to an aesthetic experience?
Well, one that immediately comes to mind is emotional expression.
Emotional expression.
Yeah. Think about the powerful emotions
Yeah.
that art can evoke. Joy, sorrow, awe.
Right.
Could aesthetic experience be about experiencing those emotions
Okay.
as they're expressed by the object, whether it's a piece of art or even something in nature?
So like if I'm looking at a painting of a stormy sea
Right.
and I feel a sense of fear or awe,
Mhm.
that's part of the aesthetic experience.
Exactly. And there are different ways to think about how this emotional expression works.
Okay.
One idea is that, the artist kind of pours their emotions into the work, and then the viewer or the listener receives those emotions.
Okay. But do artists always feel the emotions that they're depicting?
Good question.
Like, do you have to be heartbroken to write a sad song?
Right.
Yeah.
That's a good question, and one that highlights a potential problem with this theory.
Yeah.
Another view is that we project
Okay.
our own feelings and experiences onto the object,
Right.
and we're creating that emotional response ourselves.
So it's less about what the artist intended
Exactly.
and more about how we're interpreting it.
Yeah.
That makes me think about those abstract paintings
Yeah.
where people see totally different things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's where the idea of empathy comes in.
Empathy?
We're putting ourselves in the shoes of the artwork,
Interesting.
so to speak,
Right.
and imagining what it might be feeling.
It's really interesting how active we are as viewers and listeners.
Yes.
We're not just passively taking it in.
Right.
We're engaging with the work
Yeah.
on an emotional level.
I'm so glad you're making that connection.
Yeah.
And there's even more to explore when it comes to how we engage with those emotions.
Okay.
What if, instead of just feeling them, we're actually trying to understand them?
Understand them. You mean like analyze them or figure out what they mean?
More like experiencing the artwork as corresponding
Yeah.
to certain human experiences.
Like-
It's like art creates a language of emotions.
So are you saying certain colors or musical tones correspond to specific emotions?
You're getting it.
Okay.
And a philosopher named Langer
Okay.
argued that art goes beyond simply representing emotions.
Okay.
It gives us this unique way to grasp how space can mirror sentiment, how form can reflect feeling.
What's
It's
your-
like art is giving us this new language to understand our own emotions better.
Oh, that's cool.
It is really cool.
So it's not just mimicking emotions, it's shaping our understanding of them
Yes.
through this artistic language.
Precisely.
That's an amazing concept.
Yeah, it really is. And then there's this idea of transformation, which is a bit more complex.
Transformation. You mean art actually changes our emotions?
Not quite.
Okay.
But it's the idea that the act of expressing an emotion
Ah.
through art transforms that emotion, both for the artist and the observer.
Wait, I need an example. That
Yeah.
sounds a little abstract.
Okay, so let's say a musician is working through feelings of grief
Okay.
by expressing that grief through their music.
Yes.
The melodies, the harmonies, the rhythm.
Right.
They're not just depicting grief, they're transforming it into something else entirely.
Right.
And when we as listeners engage with that music, we're also undergoing a kind of transformation
Okay.
in how we understand and experience grief.
Wow, that's powerful. So it's not about art mimicking reality.
Right.
It's about art shaping
Yes.
our understanding of it.
Yeah, you got it.
Wow. And that brings us to a really important question. If art can be so powerful, can it actually teach us something about the world beyond just emotions? Can aesthetic experiences give us knowledge?
It might sound surprising,
It does.
but think back to the Romantics.
Okay.
They believe that art was like a pathway to a deeper understanding of reality,
Right?
to the absolute.
The absolute.
And German idealists like Schopenhauer believe that aesthetic experiences allow us to grasp the true essence of things.
So like a deeper, more intuitive understanding of the world
Exactly.
that goes beyond logic and reason, almost like a spiritual experience.
Exactly. It's about accessing a different kind of knowledge,
Oh.
one that's more experiential and connected to our emotions.
Wow, that's pretty profound.
It is.
But I have to admit, I'm still wrapping my head around all these different theories.
I know, it's a lot to take in. And luckily, we have more time to explore.
Ooh, that's good to hear,
Yeah.
because this deep dive is definitely living up to its name.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Next, we'll shift our focus to what's happening inside us during these experiences, those internal aspects of how we respond to art and beauty, that internal experience.
All right, let's do it. Okay, so we've talked about some of the things we focus on during an aesthetic experience, like form, emotional expression, the power to please, even this idea of knowledge, but I'm curious about what's happening on the inside. How do these experiences actually make us feel? What's that internal experience like?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it leads us to some really interesting concepts. One of the first things that comes to mind is pleasure. I mean, it's hard to imagine having an aesthetic experience without some degree of enjoyment, right?
Yeah, that seems pretty basic.
Yeah.
But is pleasure like the defining feature? Or are there other important aspects to consider?
Well, philosophers have been debating that for ages. Most agree that pleasure is a key ingredient. But there's disagreement about whether it's like the most important thing. Some argue that the mental activity involved is just as crucial. We're not just passively absorbing beauty, we're actively engaging with it, using our imaginations, making connections, interpreting meaning. That kind of mental stimulation can be incredibly pleasurable on its own.
Oh, so you're saying it's not just about the object being beautiful, it's also about how our minds are actively working to make sense of it.
Exactly. And then there's this feeling of liberation that can come with these experiences. Imagine being so engrossed in a piece of music or a breathtaking landscape that you lose track of time and all your worries. That feeling of being transported outside of yourself can be incredibly pleasurable.
I know exactly what you mean. It's like you step outside of your everyday life for a little while and enter into this different realm of experience. It's almost like a mini vacation for the mind.
I love that analogy. And some philosophers, like Schopenhauer, even believed that aesthetic experience offered a kind of refuge from the suffering of everyday life, a temporary escape from our desires and frustrations, a moment of pure contemplation and joy.
Okay, so we've got pleasure from mental stimulation, liberation, relief from suffering. Is there anything else?
Well, what about the pleasure of understanding or gaining knowledge? Remember we talked about how aesthetic experiences can be a pathway to knowledge? Well, that kind of knowledge can be incredibly satisfying to acquire.
So it's like that aha moment when you suddenly grasp a new concept, but instead of coming from a textbook, it comes from experiencing a work of art.
Precisely. It's a different kind of knowledge, not the kind you get from facts and figures, but the kind that emerges from direct intuitive experience. It's almost like the artwork is revealing a truth about the world or about yourself that you couldn't have accessed through logic or reason alone.
I'm starting to see how aesthetic experience can be so enriching.
Right.
It's tapping into all these different sources of pleasure and satisfaction. But wait, you mentioned something about connection earlier. What did you mean by that?
Yes. The pleasure of connection. Think about how art can create a sense of shared experience, of connecting with the artist or even with other people who appreciate the same work. It's that feeling of not being alone in your experience, of recognizing a shared humanity.
You know, that reminds me of going to concerts or live theater performances. There's this palpable energy in the room when everyone is experiencing the same powerful performance together. It's like art creates this invisible thread that connects us all.
Beautifully put. And Tolstoy, the famous Russian novelist, was a big believer in this idea. He saw art as a way to bridge the gap between people, to create a sense of unity and shared understanding.
I'm really starting to appreciate how multifaceted these experiences are. But we've been talking a lot about feeling and emotion. What about thought? Is there a place for our thinking minds in all of this?
Another great question. And you've hit upon a key debate in aesthetics, the role of conceptualization. Some philosophers, particularly those influenced by Romanticism, believe that aesthetic experience should be direct and unmediated. It's about pure feeling, uncluttered by thought or analysis. Just let the beauty wash over you without overthinking it.
So just let the experience flow through you without trying to dissect it or put it into words.
Exactly. But of course, not everyone agreed with this.
Right.
Other philosophers argue that thought is always involved, even when we're not consciously aware of it.
Yeah.
A philosopher named Goodman
Goodman.
emphasized that even something as abstract as music has its own internal logic and structure.
Right.
To truly understand it, you need to engage with that structure, even if it's happening on a subconscious level.
So you're saying that even when it feels like we're having a purely emotional response,
Right.
our minds are still working behind the scenes to make sense of the experience.
Exactly. Our minds are constantly trying to understand the world, even when we're experiencing beauty. Some philosophers even go as far as to say we can't have an aesthetic experience without categorizing the object. recognizing it as a painting, a song, a sculpture, or whatever it may be.
That makes me think about how we learn to appreciate different forms of art.
Right.
Like, I didn't always appreciate jazz music. It took time to learn the history, the different styles, the way the music is structured. And as I gained that understanding, my enjoyment grew.
You're highlighting an important point. Our understanding of art is shaped by our knowledge and experiences. And that means thought is inevitably playing a role in shaping our aesthetic responses.
Okay, so we've got feeling and thought working together.
Yeah.
But what about imagination? Where does that fit into the picture?
Imagination, a truly essential ingredient in the aesthetic experience.
Like it?
And like many things in aesthetics, there are multiple ways to think about it. Kant, for example, saw imagination as this free play of our mental faculties when we experience beauty. It's how we synthesize the sensory information we're receiving and create a coherent, meaningful experience.
So imagination is like the bridge between our senses and our understanding.
Exactly.
It's what allows us to connect those raw sensory inputs with our thoughts and emotions.
Yes. It's what allows us to see beyond the surface, to find meaning and connect with a work of art on a deeper level.
But isn't imagination also about going beyond what's directly presented to us? Like filling in the gaps, creating stories in our minds, imagining possibilities.
Absolutely. And that's another crucial role that imagination plays in aesthetic experience. It allows us to see as, to expand beyond our immediate perceptions and create richer, more nuanced experiences. Think about reading a novel. You're not just passively absorbing the words on the page. You're actively using your imagination to construct a whole world in your mind, complete with characters, settings, and emotions.
It's like we're co-creating the experience with the artist.
Exactly.
And that makes me think about how two people can look at the same painting and have completely different experiences.
Yes.
Based on how their imaginations are engaged.
You're absolutely right. Our individual experiences, memories, and ways of thinking all feed into how our imaginations shape those aesthetic encounters.
Wow, this is making me realize just how much is going on internally during these experiences. We're using our senses, our thoughts, our imaginations. It's like a full-body workout for the mind.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
It's a truly holistic experience.
Yeah.
And speaking of full-bodied experience, we can't forget about emotions.
Right.
We've talked about art expressing emotions. Yeah. But what about the emotions we experience as observers?
Yeah.
Do you think there's such a thing as a uniquely aesthetic emotion?
Now, that's a fascinating question.
It is.
I mean, art can evoke a whole spectrum of emotions.
Right.
Happiness, sadness, anger, fear, wonder.
Yeah.
But is there one specific emotion that's unique to aesthetic experiences?
That's the question.
One that we only feel
Yeah.
when encountering beauty or engaging with art?
That's a question that has sparked a lot of debate. Okay.
Some philosophers, like Bell, believe there is.
Okay.
He described this aesthetic emotion as a distinctive feeling of ecstasy that's triggered by works of art.
All right.
But as you can imagine, not everyone agreed with this idea.
Yeah, it seems like it would be pretty hard to pinpoint one specific emotion
Right.
that everyone experiences in the same way.
Exactly.
Across all art forms.
Yeah.
It seems like our emotional responses to art are so individual and varied.
They are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And that's why some philosophers have focused on exploring which emotions are particularly well-suited to aesthetic experiences.
Okay.
Some suggest emotions like wonder and awe are especially relevant.
Okay.
Because they heighten our awareness and open us up to new ways of seeing the world.
So you're saying that certain emotions might enhance our ability to engage with art and have a more profound aesthetic experience.
Exactly. But there are also those who argue that any emotion can be part of an aesthetic experience.
Okay.
As long as it helps us connect with and understand the work.
So if a piece of music makes you feel deeply sad, that sadness is a valid and valuable part of your aesthetic experience.
That's reassuring to hear.
Is it?
It means we don't have to judge our emotional responses or try to force ourselves to feel a certain way. It's about embracing the complexity of our individual reactions.
I couldn't agree more. And that leads us to another key concept
Yeah.
that's often misunderstood, the idea of disinterest.
Disinterest. Now, that sounds a bit counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Don't we have to be interested in something to have an aesthetic experience?
You would think, but it's not about being bored or apathetic.
Yeah.
Disinterest, in this context, is about appreciating the aesthetic object for its own sake, not for any practical purpose or personal gain.
Okay, I think I see what you mean.
Yeah.
So if I'm admiring a painting because I think it's going to increase in value,
Right.
that's not a truly disinterested aesthetic experience.
That's exactly.
It's about the art itself, not what it can do for me.
Exactly. One philosopher, Shaftesbury,
Shaftesbury.
made a great analogy.
Okay.
He said it's like admiring a coin.
Okay.
You can appreciate its craftsmanship and design without thinking about its monetary value.
Right, right.
You see the distinction.
Yeah, that's a really helpful way to think about it.
It is.
But is it really possible to be completely disinterested? Don't our personal experiences and preferences always influence how we see things?
You raise a very valid point, and there's definitely debate about how achievable true disinterest really is. But even if we can't completely detach ourselves from our personal biases, we can still strive to approach art with an open mind and a willingness to appreciate it for what it is, rather than for what we want it to be.
Right. I can see how that would lead to a richer, more rewarding experience.
It does. And that leads us to one more concept I'm curious about.
Okay.
This idea of normativity.
Normativity. What does that even mean in the context of aesthetics?
Normativity. Now we're venturing into some fascinating philosophical territory.
Oh.
It's this idea that there are right and wrong ways to experience beauty.
That we can make judgments about taste,
Okay.
and that these judgments aren't purely subjective.
So are you saying that some people have good taste and others don't? Like there's an objectively correct way to respond to art?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. It's not about dictating a single correct response, but recognizing that our aesthetic experiences are shaped by cultural norms, historical contexts, and our own personal development.
So, like, what was considered beautiful in ancient Greece might not be considered beautiful today.
Exactly. And that raises all sorts of questions about how we develop our taste, how we learn to appreciate different art forms, and whether there are any universal principles of good taste.
Wow, this deep dive is really living up to its name.
It is.
We've gone from pretty sunsets
I know, right?
to some seriously deep philosophical concepts.
It's all connected.
It is.
And we're not done yet. There's still so much more to uncover as we delve further into this idea of normativity. Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle this whole normativity thing in aesthetic experience. It's like we're moving from I like this to this should be liked, which, I don't know, feels a little bold to say about taste.
Yeah, it is bold, but it's not about, like, some rigid set of rules.
Right.
It's more about this feeling, you know?
Yeah.
Sometimes you encounter something beautiful and you get this sense of rightness.
Okay.
Like certain aesthetic experiences are just, like, merited or appropriate to the object. You know, it's like, well, if this is beautiful, then everyone should see it that way.
But doesn't that kind of imply that there's a correct way to experience art? Like, are we saying that some people are just wrong if they don't feel the right emotion?
You've hit on one of the big challenges with this concept.
Okay.
How can we have subjective feelings and a sense of this is right when it comes to aesthetics?
Right.
Even philosophers like Kant and Hume, way back when, recognized this was tricky.
Right.
They didn't think beauty was some hard fact out there in the world. Like, you know, the weight of an object or something.
But we do talk about it like it's a real thing, right?
They do.
Well, you say, this sunset is beautiful, not just, I find this sunset beautiful.
Exactly. And that's what makes this so fascinating.
Yeah.
A philosopher named Santayana, writing in the late 1800s,
Okay.
he said that beauty is like pleasure objectified.
Pleasure objectified.
It's almost like we experience it as if it belongs to the object itself, not just to our reaction.
So we're like projecting our feeling of pleasure onto the thing.
Yeah.
But it's more profound than just saying, I like this.
Yes.
It's like recognizing something in the object itself that warrants that feeling.
You're getting it. And Santayana, he knew this didn't mean that pleasure really is part of the object.
Right.
Literally, you know,
Yeah.
it's more about how we experience it.
Yeah.
This feeling that, like, our pleasure is called forth or demanded by the object itself.
That makes me think about how some art just feels so universal.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to be an art expert to be moved by a powerful piece of music or something.
Right.
Could that be part of what they're getting at? This sense that some works tap into something deeper.
Absolutely.
Something that resonates on a fundamental level.
Yeah, and this idea of shared aesthetic experience brings us to another age-old debate. Taste.
Oh, yes. Taste.
If there's some kind of correctness to aesthetic experience,
Right.
does that mean some people have better taste than others?
The taste debate. Always a fun one.
It is one that philosophers have been wrestling with for centuries.
I bet.
Some, like Kant, believed in a universal aesthetic judgment, like a standard of taste that everyone should, in theory, be able to agree upon.
Interesting.
Others, like Scruton, he acknowledged that, like, individual experiences and cultural contexts.
Yeah.
They play a huge role in shaping our preferences.
Right. I mean, just look at how art styles have changed over time.
Exactly.
What was considered the epitome of good taste 100 years ago might seem totally outdated today. And even within the same time period, people have such different preferences.
You're right. And that's what makes this such a complex issue. It leads to this debate between what philosophers call particularists and generalists.
Right.
Those who think that, universal principles of taste are impossible.
Right.
And those who believe we can at least reason about taste
Gotcha.
and try to understand its underlying principles.
So are we doomed to just disagree about what constitutes good art? Is there no way to have, a productive conversation about taste?
I wouldn't say we're doomed at all.
No.
Even if there aren't hard and fast rules,
Right.
we can still engage in meaningful conversations about our experiences.
Right.
We can try to articulate our interpretations, listen to different perspectives,
Right.
maybe even expand our own understanding of art in the process.
Yeah, I like that. It's about sharing the journey
It is.
of aesthetic discovery.
Yes.
Even if we don't all arrive at the same destination.
Beautifully said. And that's part of what makes art and aesthetic experience so enriching.
Right.
It's an ongoing process of exploration,
Yeah.
interpretation, and connection.
Right.
There's no single right answer.
Right.
And that open-endedness is part of what makes it so fascinating.
So after this whirlwind tour of aesthetic theories, where does that leave us? I feel like we've unpacked a whole suitcase full of ideas
right.
about beauty and pleasure and emotion and knowledge and taste.
We have. And I hope you've come away with a deeper appreciation for just how complex and multifaceted these experiences can be.
Yeah.
We've seen that it's about much more than just pretty pictures or catchy tunes.
Right.
It's about engaging with the world in a thoughtful, feeling, and imaginative way.
I like that.
It's about those moments where we're captivated by something.
Yeah.
Not for its practical use,
Right.
but for its sheer power to move us, teach us, connect us to something larger than ourselves.
I know. I'm definitely feeling inspired to go out and have more of these experiences.
Yeah.
And I'm sure I'll be looking at them with a whole new set of lenses after all these fascinating discussions.
That's the spirit. And remember, these experiences aren't limited to museums and concert halls.
Right.
They're all around us in nature, in everyday objects, in the way light filters through the trees, in the sound of laughter, in the kindness of strangers.
Right.
It's about cultivating that sense of awareness and appreciation for the beauty that's woven into the fabric of our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you, dear listener. What are you going to go experience? And more importantly, how will you now think about it, given all we've discussed? That's the homework, folks. Until next time, keep those minds open and those senses engaged.